True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
Candace Mossler was a well-known socialite in Houston, Texas in the 1960s. She was charming and attractive, in a Marilyn Monroe type of way, with a voluptuous figure, an easy smile, and a soft, breathy voice, much like the late actress. She was a woman who could have anything she wanted, until what she wanted threatened to end her lavish lifestyle. Candace lived in a 3-story mansion in one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods, purchased by her much older, wealthier financier husband, Jacques Mossler. While Candace loved parties and hosting charity events with famous performers and the Houston elite, Jacques preferred to work. He spent much of his time in Miami, where much of his business was done. Join us at the quiet end for The Incestuous Wife. Candace and the Mosslers' 6 children were visiting Jacques in Miami when she went to the hospital for one of her frequent migraines. She took the children along with her. When they returned to Jacques' Miami apartment, they found him dead and covered in blood on his living room floor. Candace would tell the police that her husband had enemies and that he was a closeted homosexual, implying that a male lover or a scorned business contact was responsible for his death. But as investigators looked into Candace's behavior in the months leading up to her husband's death, accusing eyes turned to Candace.
So we got a Florida beer. The only small difficulty is it's on the opposite coast. This is a Cigar City beer called Maduro Brown Ale on the Gulf Coast, and the crime took place on the Atlantic coast. But nevertheless, it's still the same state.
I don't think we care.
I can tell. So, Maduro Brown Ale. I'm not a big brown ale fan, but this is exquisite. It's probably one of the best brown ales, and probably even one of the best beers overall. It's 5.5% alcohol by volume. It's a dark brown color, a little bit of red highlights to it. Nice aroma of caramel and sort of some earthiness. Taste is caramel, a little chocolate, a little tobacco. I think that's the earthiness there. It's a rich, tasty beer. Try it. You can drink more than one. It's only 5.5% alcohol by volume, and you will thank Uncle Dick for that beer.
Absolutely. But I'm not calling you Uncle. That's weird. Especially when we're doing this story. All right, let's open it up.
Okay.
All right, join me down here at the quiet end.
Here I am.
Let's drink some of those brown ales. Not usually my favorite type of beer, but I think I can really enjoy this one, so let's do it.
No, I mean, if you have a 6-pack of brown ales, it's probably going to last for a long time in your fridge. But this is a really good one. You'll drink it quickly.
Absolutely. So
let's get started. Candace Grace Weatherby was born in Buchanan, Georgia, February 18th, 1920. She, as an adult in her 40s and 50s, she claimed that she was actually born in 1927, so that made her 7 years younger. We'll talk more about that later. The town of Buchanan had a population of under 1,000 people, and there wasn't a lot to do there. Candace was the 5th of 9 children, born to Lizzie and Lonnie Weatherby. This couple lost their first child, Velma, who died as a baby in 1910, and that's when Lizzie was only a 16-year-old. Lonnie and Lizzie went on to have 6 sons and 3 daughters. Then in 1932, Lizzie delivered a stillborn baby girl, and she then died from complications of that delivery. That's tragic. Holy cow.
It is tragic, but didn't stuff like that happen more often back then?
Sure, 20s and 30s.
Especially if you're having that many kids. That's not good for your health. It's hard on a woman's body.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Now, her sudden death at the age of just 38 did set off some very hard times for the family. Lonnie found actually that he was unable to raise his children, 6 kids, alone, and he couldn't cope with the financial responsibilities of providing for such a large family. So he was in deep stuff, as we say.
Yeah, according to what Candace would say, her father had a nervous breakdown, and he left all of his children with his in-laws and moved away. Didn't move very far, though. He settled in Cedartown, just 30 miles north of Buchanan, and that's where he remarried. Candace and the other minor children lived with their maternal grandparents, the Brannons, in Buchanan. William Brannon was a bishop in the Mormon Church. He and his wife Priscilla had already raised 6 children of their own, including Candace's mother, of course, Lizzie. So they were in their 60s when they took over the care of their Weatherby grandchildren. So it was a bit of a sacrifice. It wasn't easy, that's for sure.
Oh, gosh, quite a task. I mean, these are young kids.
Yes. And it's not like they had oodles of money to hire help either.
Right.
So abandoned and living in poverty, young Candace dreamed of having a life outside of Buchanan. One day, she said, she would live in the big cities that she had heard about on the radio and read about in magazines. She loved to read the movie tabloids and fashion magazines that were brought to her by family or friends who visited Atlanta. She wanted a life where she could wear designer dresses, and she really dreamed of becoming a fashion designer. In school, she would tell her peers, "I'm going to be famous someday." Then as Candace entered her teenage years, her grandfather William, the Mormon bishop, began to look for a husband for her. It wasn't unusual for a girl to leave school and marry young during the Great Depression, and in 1937, at age 17, Candace dropped out of her junior year of high school, and she married a Colorado man who'd been chosen for her by her grandfather.
Now, this husband was Albert Norman Johnson. I guess people called him Norman. He was a handsome, hard-working man who was 11 years older than Candace. He had Swedish ancestry. He stood 5'10", blonde hair and blue eyes. Candace did love and respect her grandfather, so she complied with his wishes. And she and Norman moved to Anniston, Alabama, which is 50 miles west of Buchanan, and Norman was working there for a concrete company. Norman's salary of just over $1,300 per year still meant that Candace lived in poverty, but at least her basic needs were met.
Yeah, I think she was a little insulted that her grandfather thought that was the best she could do. And as the years went by, she saw, wow, I could probably do better than this. But Candace and Norman were able to rent a small house, and in 1940, Candace gave birth to a son, who they named Norman Weatherby Johnson. But motherhood did not give Candace the happiness that she'd been craving. Buchanan was less than an hour's drive away, but Candace didn't have a car, so she was rarely able to visit her friends and her family back home. She had just turned 20, and she was a wife and mother with adult responsibilities. So she really felt like she was missing out on the parties and trips her former classmates were enjoying. She felt like she had lost what were supposed to be the happiest years of her youth.
Yeah, and the age difference between Norman and Candace grew to be more of a problem the longer they were together. So Norman would come home each night, tired from working in the cement plant. Money was too scarce for nights out to go to the movies or restaurants. So Candace was bored and lonely. Desperate for any kind of social connections, Candace became a volunteer hostess for the United Service Organization, the USO. This was at the beginning of World War II. And then she met Winthrop Rockefeller, who happened to be the grandson of John D. Rockefeller, and John D. happened to be the wealthiest man in America. So this is a serendipitous meeting, isn't it?
Well, she certainly saw it as an opportunity, I'm sure. Winthrop, though, was a wild young man, and he'd been asked to leave Yale. He then worked as a roughneck in the oil fields of Texas. Aside from being an unusual choice for someone from such an affluent family, it was a way for him to learn the family business. In his mid-20s, he returned to New York and was given a position in the Rockefeller Charity, the New York Fund. While in that position, he changed a lot and would spend the rest of his life working in public service and philanthropy. Winslow enlisted in the U.S. Army in January of 1941, almost a year before America entered into World War II, as a private. So he was sent to Fort Benning, Georgia for basic training.
Private Rockefeller was proud and committed to serving his country, and the Army saw his service as a recruiting tool for other young men. So his photo is often in the newspapers. And before the end of 1941, he was promoted as sergeant. He was promoted again in early 1942 to the rank of second lieutenant. In February 1942, He was a machine gun instructor at Fort Benning. It's just over 100 miles away from Anniston. Winslow Rockefeller was one of the country's most eligible bachelors when he met Candace in March of 1942. He was one of about 100 soldiers who were taken on a bus from Fort Benning to a USO dance party in Anniston.
I just find this whole story fascinating.
Me too.
I just love this kind of history.
This is old-time stuff, isn't it?
It is. So Candace and the other volunteer hostesses served cookies and other sweets to the young men who would soon be fighting in the war. The female volunteers in Anniston were chaperoned, but Winslow managed to win over Candace, and they started a sexual affair. Candace's marriage to Norman was already falling apart, and Candace began meeting up with Winslow in Buchanan hotel rooms, leaving her son Norman with neighbors or family members. And by the spring of 1943, Candace was pregnant for the second time, but probably not by the same man.
Yeah, but we don't know.
We don't know. So in January of 1944, Rockefeller was promoted to major, and this took him to Guam, followed by Okinawa. During a kamikaze attack in the Allied invasion on Okinawa in 1945, he was injured with burns on his arms and his face, and he was awarded the Bronze Star and the Purple Heart in 1945. Candace gave birth to her daughter, Candace Rita Johnson, on December 17, 1943, just weeks before Winslow Rockefeller was sent to the Pacific. So little Rita was given the Johnson surname, although we don't know if Norman really believed this baby girl was his. But she had blonde hair like Candace, Norman, and little Norman, so most people, of course, assumed that Candace's husband was Rita's father.
Right, but when later questioned about the end of her marriage to Norman, Candace gave contradictory statements. She claimed that Norman became ill and was no longer able to work, but then she told a reporter, "Norman's a fine man, but he was much older than me, and we really had nothing in common."
So the first newspaper article in the Anniston Star to be published about Candace actually works well as an early example of her delusional interpretations of her past. In August of 1947, Candace traveled back to Anniston to take a break from her demanding and incredibly successful career, she said. She told the Star that her 1947 visit was her first trip back to Anniston in 8 years, which would have meant that she was not living there when the birth announcement for her son was run in that same newspaper back in 1940.
Whoops, caught you there.
So the 1940 U.S. Census lists Candace as an unpaid family worker living with her husband in Anniston at the time of little Norman's birth, too. So she's kind of caught in some lies there.
Well, and there's more.
Yes.
She also shared a story that she and her husband had been having dinner at the Brown Derby restaurant in Los Angeles when she was discovered. One of the movie studio's talent scouts had offered her a contract, she said, but she turned them down. Hollywood lost out, but Candace let her admirers in Alabama know that she had found success in the fashion world. She claimed to have spent the past several years in New York, both modeling and studying fashion. And later, she would say that she had been the youngest fashion designer ever in New York City. She said that she also worked in New York as a model, posing in print ads for toothpaste.
Well, you know, money and fame were always Candace's metric for success. Her plan, she said, was to expand her business into Houston. Candace didn't mention where her husband was since her Brown Derby discovery in Hollywood. Her timeline would have put Candace as the chief designer for a major fashion line when she was just 22 years old, and this was with no training at all. And if her later claims of being born in 1927 were true, she would have been New York's first 15-year-old lead designer.
Well, we know that that's not correct.
It's doubtful, because in reality, Candace and Norman broke up before this Hollywood story. Even decades later, the facts of their divorce were quite murky. Interestingly, coinciding with Candace's story of modeling and fashion design in New York, Winthrop Rockefeller was living there after his discharge from the Army in 1945. Rockefeller never publicly acknowledged paternity of little Rita, but it is reasonable to postulate that he gave financial support to Candace. How else was she affording things? If any of Candace's claims of modeling in New York were true, Rockefeller probably used his connections to help her. Like his older brother Nelson Rockefeller, Winslow would one day enter into politics, so the acknowledgement of a love child would definitely have ended his political career.
It certainly would have. So Winslow did marry an actress whose name was Barbara, went by Bobo, Barbara Sears, and this is in February 1948. Bobo looked a lot like Candace. She was a petite, pretty blonde. And Bobo gave birth to a son, Winthrop Jr., just 7 months after their wedding. So Bobo complained about Winslow's serial adultery and heavy drinking, and the couple divorced in 1954.
Yeah, so that's a 6-year marriage.
Yep.
Another thing is that they got married when she was already 2 months pregnant, so you have to wonder if that's what made the marriage happen in the first place.
Oh, you certainly would.
Yeah. And because this was before DNA technology, there was no way to prove if Candace's daughter Rita was Rockefeller's child. But he was a part of Candace's life until his death in 1973. More than once, his influence and money rescued her. Both of her children called him Uncle Win. In a 1973 civil action, months after his death, Candace was asked if Rockefeller was Rita's father. Her attorney helped her so she didn't have to answer that question, but it seems unlikely that he would have kept a connection with Candace, who after all was, a housewife from Anniston, Alabama, if he hadn't fathered her child.
I would certainly be suspicious of that.
Yes.
Because there wouldn't be any reason.
Well, she did have kind of a way with men, but he probably could have been with pretty much any woman because of his wealth.
Well, absolutely.
So there were rumors that Candace was earning some of her money by working as an escort in New Orleans. There were also rumors that she was running a business of sex workers, not models. Stories were told that soldiers would visit her house for dance lessons. They'd dance for a while with one of the women there, and then accompany a woman into a bedroom for private time. So this worked out for both Candace and the soldiers, who were actually able to use their GI benefits to pay for these dance lessons.
Now, Jacques Mossler emigrated from Romania to the U.S. with his family as his child. They arrived in Buffalo, New York in 1901. Now, when Jacques was about 12 years old, his parents separated. His mother, Sophie, and the children relocated to Chicago. Jacques' older brother, Marcus, was naturalized as a U.S. citizen in 1914, and his father settled in the Bronx, where he worked as a painter. In Chicago, Jacques dropped out of school to help support his mother and siblings. Selling newspapers and candy on the downtown streets of Chicago exposed him to capitalism. He saw the well-dressed businessmen walking with purpose down the crowded streets. He was also exposed to the darker side of the finance world. And as a street vendor, Jacques learned about playing the numbers. He soon learned that a good way to make money was to give small loans and charge high interest rates. He learned how to sell money, and in just a few years he was earning his fortune by giving automobile loans to people who couldn't pay full price for cars. The Model T was less than $1,000 when mass production began, but that was not affordable for many working people. It was actually not affordable for the vast majority of working people.
That's true. That was a lot of money back then.
But by 1910, car ownership in the U.S. grew from under 1,000 to more than 500,000. A financing source was needed, and Jacques eagerly took that on as his business.
Yeah, it's surprising to me that the Ford Motor Company didn't offer any financing to its buyers until the 1920s. Apparently, Henry Ford didn't want to be repossessing vehicles from people who fell on hard times. But still, people needed cars. It was becoming that kind of society.
It was.
By 1915, when Jacques was 19, he moved to New Orleans to work as a loan manager for a local car dealer. In 1917, he married 17-year-old Evelyn May Kaiser, and he joined the U.S. Army, but he was never sent to battle. He received full veteran status, and in 1924, he became a naturalized citizen of the U.S., which was very important to him. Then in 1918, Jacques incorporated a used car business of his own, Mossler Motor Exchange. When vehicles had to be repossessed, he saw them as a new source of revenue. he became one of the first car rental entrepreneurs in the region. In the early years of running this company, his wife Evelyn worked as its secretary and bookkeeper. In 1919, Jacques and Evelyn were able to buy their first home, and by 1930, they moved into a larger home. The first of their 4 daughters, Jacqueline, was born in 1930, and by 1935, they had 3 more daughters. Then, in 1944, the family moved into one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods, and they were able to hire a live-in housekeeper. So then they had really made it.
Yeah, most of Jacques' credit business was run under Masler Acceptance Corporation and the Allen Parker Auto Finance Company. Marketing to auto dealers across the United States, he held the notes on many thousands of auto loans and was soon a very wealthy man, I guess. I mean, he was at the right place at the right time, wasn't he?
He was, but also quite a go-getter.
Well, yeah, you have to be.
You would have to be. So let me just talk to you for a moment about Best Fiends.
Oh, sure.
When I'm able to grab a moment to myself, I really make the most of it by playing my favorite mobile puzzle game, Best Fiends. You know, it's a great way to shut off the stresses of life, just unplug and have some fun. It's perfect for passing time in a line, a waiting room, or even during the commercial breaks of my favorite TV shows. Best Fiends is a mobile puzzle game that anyone can download and play. Whether you have minutes or hours, it's always right there on your phone. And the more you play, the more challenges you face. New characters and puzzles are added all of the time, and there are also fun events where you get to compete for in-game rewards. It's just so much fun.
And what I really appreciate about Best Fiends is the intricate storyline, complete with collectible fiends and fun, brain-boosting puzzles. I play often, but my favorite time to play is just before I go to sleep. I found it's an easy way to unwind. Our Best Fiends has new content added constantly, so you'll never get bored. I'm quite far along and nipping at Jill's heels at level 720. And with literally thousands of levels, I never have to worry about running out of gameplay.
Well, the more you play, the more fiends join your team and the more powerful they become, helping you to solve increasingly challenging puzzles as you progress through the game. I've turned many of our friends and family members on to Best Fiends, and they've thanked me for it. Most have even said that Best Fiends is their favorite mobile game of all time, so that's saying something.
Well, playing Best Fiends just fits so well into any lifestyle. The storyline is epic, and the graphics are amazing. Download Best Fiends free today on the App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R. Best Fiends.
So how did Candace meet Jacques Mossler? According to Candace, she was given a list of wealthy New Orleans businessmen from whom to solicit donations for the Opera Association in 1947. One name on the list, Harry Latter, was the owner of the building where she had her modeling studio, and Latter was a friend and business associate of Jacques Mossler. When he saw Jacques' name on Candace's list, he chuckled and wished her good luck. Jacques had a big reputation as a very cheap guy when it came to charity. So Candace went to the corporate offices of Mossler Motor Exchange, but Jacques told her he really had no interest in opera. But she told him he had a civic duty to help with cultural things in the community, even if he personally didn't care for them. So she was able to get him to write her a check for $25, which wasn't a lot. They were expecting like $350 from him at least. But it seems like she really kind of caught his eye at that point.
Yeah, I mean, if she's been told by his associate that he just doesn't do that sort of stuff, even though she only got a small check, she got his attention.
Absolutely she did. Because a few weeks after meeting him in his office, Candace was visiting the New Orleans Zoo on a Saturday afternoon with her 2 kids, Norman and Rita. And while walking through the zoo, Candace noticed an older man who kept taking photos of her children with a 35 millimeter camera. So this seemed kind of creepy, but she eventually recognized the man as Jacques Mossler. He told her that he lived nearby and was trying out a new camera for the first time. The children and the zoo animals made good subjects, he told her. So whether this was the truth or not, Jacques and Candace began seeing each other from then on.
Well, it sounds a little too cute for me, how they met.
Or a little creepy.
So there's more to this, I'm sure.
I'm sure. Because she was such a liar.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like she could say too much without lying.
No.
Now, at the time when they started seeing each other, Jacques was still married, and he had 4 teenage daughters. Not only that, he was 52, and Candace was 27. Now, when asked about the timing of her romance with Mossler, Candace claimed that he was divorced from his first wife when they began dating. But on other times, she said that he was in the process of getting a divorce when they met. And the status of her own marriage to Norman Johnson was unknown.
Well, documents have been found related to both of their marriages. On May 28, 1956, Jacques' ex-wife Evelyn filed an application to be repatriated as an American citizen. And she did this because she was under the impression that she had forfeited her U.S. citizenship when she'd married him, and he wasn't a U.S. citizen in 1917. But she never lost her citizenship status. Still, when completing the citizenship application 7 years after their divorce, she gave the details of her marriage to Jacques. And the date of their marriage was June 29, 1917, and the date of their divorce was May 12, 1949. Jacques and Candace completed their application for a marriage license in Florida on May 20th, 1949, just 8 days after Jacques and Evelyn's divorce was finalized. And the marriage license, signed by both Jacques and Candace, lists May 24th, 1949 as their wedding date. So there were really just 12 days between his divorce and his marriage to Candace. On the license, Candace listed her occupation as none, so she didn't mention owning a modeling agency or a modeling school or anything. So the whole thing's a little hokey.
A little bit. Now, after the wedding, Jacques and Candace left New Orleans and set up their home and new business headquarters in Houston. The oil business was booming in the 50s, and it was a perfect place to expand his businesses. So Jacques and Candace bought a 3-acre lot in the exclusive River Oaks section of town, and they built what can only be called an estate.
Yeah, a mansion. It was big.
It was big. Brick, 3 stories, fully staffed with butlers, gardeners, maids, cooks, and a chauffeur. 5 bedrooms, 5 baths, with a 7-car garage because Jacques had a luxury car collection.
Well, and Candace eagerly worked her way into Houston high society.
Yeah, that's her goal.
Absolutely. She gave money to several local causes, she threw fundraisers in her home, and she flirted shamelessly with the older men. Rumors from her life in New Orleans, of course, followed her to Houston, including that she had been a call girl in the French Quarter. But it was hard to criticize her too much because she was a very generous philanthropist. She volunteered for the Boys Club, the public pool, and at more than one hospital. So she did seem like a good person in many ways.
She was sharing the wealth.
Absolutely.
Now, in January of 1957, things changed quite a bit for the Mosslers. Jacques called his wife to tell her about 4 local kids. They were siblings ages 2 to 6 who had been left parentless and homeless after their father had shot their mother to death and stabbed their baby brother to death.
Oh, this is just a tragic story.
Horrible story.
This was a guy with some severe mental illness.
Yeah, Leonard Glenn had been hearing voices in his head for years. There were periods of time when the voices would go away, but they always returned. And with the voices came dark thoughts and bouts of violence. Now, his father, Everett, arranged to have Leonard committed to the mental ward of Elgin State Hospital in 1954 out of the concern that he could do harm to himself or to others. But after only 4 months of confinement, Leonard's wife Betty petitioned for his release, and he returned home. Leonard's illness was still uncontrolled after his discharge from the hospital, and in the fall of 1956, Betty gave birth to their 5th child, naming him Alexander. Now, the family had already been struggling because Leonard had difficulty keeping a job, which at the time was working as a freight handler for a trucking company, and the family had moved into an apartment on Chicago's north side.
So this is just a horrible story. It was the evening of January 9th, 1957, when Leonard confronted Betty about a supposed extramarital affair she was having. And in this argument, Betty said she would begin the proceedings necessary to have him returned to the hospital. So Betty slept on a cot in the living room, refusing to sleep in the same room as Leonard. And her 6-month-old baby Alexander slept beside her. Their 5-year-old Daniel and 2-year-old Eddie were asleep near their mother too. 6-year-old Martha and 4-year-old Christopher were asleep in a bedroom. But while Betty was asleep, Leonard took a hunting rifle from his closet and just walked right over and shot her in the head. Daniel and Eddie were both awakened by the sound of the gunshots. And Eddie, sadly he was used to such a crazy household, just told his dad, "Put the gun down, Daddy." So Leonard took his gun and went back to his bedroom. But the next morning the children woke up to their mother lying on the cot in the living room with blood on her face. The older ones realized that something terrible must have happened during the night. Leonard told the children that their mother was ill and sleeping, and that he would stay home from work to take care of them that day. The children just steered clear of him and played quietly in the apartment as their mother's body lay in the front room. That evening, 2 of the boys were wrestling in the kitchen when one of them fell to the floor, and the vibrations of the floor caused Leonard's hunting rifle to fall from its resting place in the bedroom, and it went off. Baby Alexander was asleep in the room where it went off, and the noise startled him, so he started to cry. But hearing the rifle shot and the baby's cry, Leonard assumed that Alexander must have been accidentally shot. Now actually the bullet had ricocheted off the ceiling and landed harmlessly on Alexander's bed. But Leonard was very insane. His demons convinced him that the baby had been wounded, even though he couldn't see a wound. So he took a 6-inch buck knife from his dresser, and he began to cut into his little son's belly, looking for the bullet.
This guy's far gone.
What a horror.
Now, near midnight that same night, 2 police officers saw Leonard's older model car was stuck in a pile of snow. This had been piled onto the sidewalk by a snowplow. The officers approached the car and tapped on the driver's window glass to offer help. So Leonard rolled down his window, and the officers could look inside. 4 small kids, underdressed for the cold weather, were huddled together in the back seat trying to keep warm. They were barefoot, and they actually would be later treated for frostbite. And on the front passenger seat, the officers saw the infant, Alexander, dressed in a snowsuit. But to their shock, the suit was soaked in blood, and the baby wasn't moving.
Yeah, but Leonard was calm, and he just explained what had happened in the past 2 days like it was nothing. An officer called for an ambulance, and they handcuffed Leonard and took the 4 older children to a heated police car. 6-month-old Alexander Glenn was still alive, but barely, and he died after arriving at the Westlake Hospital. An inquest was held to establish the causes of death for Betty and Alexander Glenn. Leonard had easily confessed to these crimes, blaming his actions on dark voices in his head. The only witnesses to Leonard's crimes were his 4 surviving children. The 2 oldest, Martha and Daniel, were called in for the public inquest, and they had to give their account of what had happened in the 2 days before their father's arrest. Leonard was committed to the Illinois Security Hospital. The 2 murder indictments against him were dismissed, but they could be reinstated if he was later found to be sane. But Leonard would never see his 4 remaining children again. At the time of the Glenn family tragedy in Chicago, Jacques Mossler was in the city for a meeting with the board of one of his banks. So the Glenn story was a headline in the city's newspapers, and it was also on the news.
Yeah, a double homicide in one family was absolutely shocking. And as Jacques read the story in his morning newspapers, he considered the future of the 4 orphan minors if they entered into the Cook County Child Protective System. 2 of Betty Glenn's brothers had taken the children into their homes, but they already had 7 kids of their own. So that was going to be tough to manage a few more.
Yeah, but I think that Candace and Jacques could really kind of understand because they both had difficult childhoods.
Right.
So the 4 Glenn children would have to be separated and placed into foster homes. Their difficult childhoods triggered memories for Jacques of his own childhood. And after brief consideration, he decided that he would rescue the Glenn children. So he called up Candace, who was in Georgia. And Candace listened to this heartbreaking story and flew out to Chicago that same day. Jacques called in some favors. The chairman of one of the city's largest banks had made some calls. So before the end of the day, Mossler had spoken to a judge about adopting all 4 of the Glenn children. And it was less than 3 weeks after their mother's murder when the Glenn children moved into the Mossler estate.
Yeah, this is an inspiring story. The Chicago media described how the young victims of their father's mental illness had boarded a private jet and moved into Houston's upper class. Candace allowed a reporter into their home to see the idyllic circumstances in which these unfortunate children had ended up. When asked if she expected to be granted permanent custody, Candace replied, "We have nothing temporary in mind, only permanent adoption." Candace even summed up the situation by saying, "They are already so happy, they are anxious to be loved and to feel wanted."
So it does seem like this was really a good thing to do for these children, although unfortunately they would end up living in dysfunction with the Mosslers, even though they'd be wealthy. But that August, Judge Kerner, who had granted temporary custody to the Mosslers, approved their petition to adopt the children. In the adoption hearing, Kerner clarified the state's position when it came to the adopted children's standing in the Mossler family. He explained that the 4 children would share in the estate just the same as their biological children would. Jacques spoke, agreeing for both himself and Candace, but that financial commitment to the adopted children would have to be tested in a Texas court many years down the road.
No surprise. There's a lot of money here.
It turns out to be a lot of money.
Candace became famous in Houston as she did charity work for the United Fund, which raised money for the Texas Children's Hospital. She also worked as the chair of fundraising for the Houston Opera. And she seemed like a remarkable mother. She turned the ballroom in their house into a giant playroom for the kids. Her chauffeur drove the kids to movies, bowling, the family ranch, and their beach house in Galveston. So from all appearances, it looked like the ideal life.
I'm envious. I don't know about you, but it sounds wonderful. Sounds like the perfect childhood, especially after being through so many horrors in their young lives.
Well, yes, as we say, money isn't everything.
No, it's not. It's not. So then in 1961, Candace received a call from her older sister, Elizabeth. Elizabeth's 20-year-old son, Mel, was in jail. Now, Mel had been a troubled kid. He was expelled from school, and he had taken a job going door to door selling magazine subscriptions. During one trip to Michigan, Mel had sold $20,000 of worthless stock to an 89-year-old man. So he was convicted of fraud, and he was sentenced to serve 90 days in jail. Elizabeth asked Candace if Mel could stay with her and Jacques after completing his jail term until he found a job and got his life together. And Candace readily agreed to take in her nephew.
Mel was a pet project for Candace. He was a good-looking guy, big and muscular. Now, Candace gave him his own bedroom. She gave him a new car to drive. She also paid for him to be circumcised, have his tonsils removed, get his ears cosmetically fixed so they didn't stick out so much, and have skin treatments for his acne scars. So she was very generous.
Very generous. Well, he was kind of, like you said, a project, kind of like a toy almost for her.
Yes. And Mel spent increasing amounts of time hanging around with his Aunt Candy. She enjoyed taking him to lunch at her favorite restaurants, and she took him along on her frequent shopping trips to Neiman Marcus. During these trips, Mel would always return with some clothing or other treats, and a familiarity between the two grew into intimacy. Publicly, Mel became a social stand-in whenever Jacques was needed. Publicly, Mel became a social stand-in whenever Jacques was unavailable. Privately, Mel was more than happy to take over as his aunt's lover.
Well, Jacques gave Mel a job as a repossessor for one of his loan companies, and he was a good employee with the salesman's gift of gab. But by June of 1963, just 18 months after he arrived, rumors were really spreading about what was going on at the Mossler estate. Jacques had fired Mel and had him escorted off of the property, also telling him to never return. After that, Jacques left Houston and spent most of his time in his luxury Florida apartment.
So they're basically now living separate lives, right?
Basically.
Candace is in Houston, reigning over Houston society.
Yes.
And Jacques in Miami.
Yes, but they're not officially separated.
Right. I understand that.
And Candace told everyone that Mel had been kicked out because he had announced that he had plans to leave his job and start his own business. And she said that Jacques had just gone to Florida to oversee some operations at a Miami bank. They were all just getting along fine, she insisted, but that doesn't seem to be the case.
No, there seems to be some stress and turmoil.
Oh, for sure. In June of 1964, right after the end of the school year, Candace and the children traveled to Florida. She seemed to be enjoying days at the beach with her children, but in the evenings, Candace made trips to the local hospital to get injections for her recurring migraines. And she took the children with her to the hospital, sometimes keeping them out with her in the middle of the night. But the kids claimed not to mind. They understood that their mother was more of a night person, and it was kind of an adventure to get in the car and drive off at night to the hospital. On the night of June 29th, leading into the early morning of June 30th, 3 of the Mossler children were on a 2-week visit with their father. One of the boys was still at summer camp in Texas, and he was expected to join his siblings the next week. Now, 69 years old, Jacques had spent the morning with his children on the beach, and then he'd gone into his office. Around midnight, Candace had left the apartment with the children, who were all staying a few blocks away at a hotel. There really wasn't enough room in his apartment for everyone to stay overnight. And anyway, Candace liked to have the room at the hotel.
So she would spend sometimes with Jacques in the apartment and sometimes at the hotel.
Yes, but she basically slept at the hotel.
Yeah.
And, according to what most people thought at the time, she spent most of that time with Mel, and Jacques was aware of that.
Right. And Jacques knew that his wife's boyfriend had flown in from Houston the previous week and that he had accompanied her on a 3-day trip to Nassau while the 3 children stayed with him. So obviously any effort at discretion in her affair was long gone. And the household staff had finally felt they had to inform Jacques about her behavior. Her conduct had become even more audacious after he confronted her, and humiliation had driven him to move out of the mansion in Houston, and here he was living in a small apartment in Miami.
Well, he had been advised by his legal team to establish residence in Florida in preparation for a very public divorce. Of course, there was also a lot of money at stake. Jacques had built a financial organization with multiple banks and personal loan corporations. Now he was living alone, separated from his children. Candace enjoyed the lifestyle that his businesses supported, but as he got older and became less interested in sex, Candace indulged in sex outside of the marriage. Over the years, she became more reckless and less attentive to her husband. The children's visit to Miami was painful because his children had lost respect for him, because their mother had emasculated him in front of the children over and over again.
The plan was for the children to go to a boarding school in Switzerland when the Florida visit ended. Jacques had seen through Candace's explanation that the children of their social class would benefit from studying abroad and social connections made through a prestigious school. Jacques suspected that his wife's true motive was having the estate in Houston to herself so she could carry on with her lover.
/nephew.
/nephew, thank you. Jacques also saw the benefit in getting the children out of the dysfunctional environment inside their own home.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, now when he had adopted them 7 years earlier, he had rescued them from an unimaginable family tragedy.
Yeah.
Except now he felt terrible that they were in the middle of another family crisis. So he decided that he would put up with Candace in Miami because it would give him more time with the kids.
Yeah, so he seemed like a decent guy. Certainly
Yeah,
not
much.
The perfect father, but pretty decent.
Well, I think he was trying.
Yes. Since we have no way of really knowing what exactly happened in Jacques' apartment that night, let's go over what the evidence tells us likely occurred, and we can put together a pretty reasonable scenario of what probably happened. So about 1:30 a.m. on the morning of June 30th, Jacques saw a pair of headlights coming eastward on Sunrise Drive toward the apartment building. Now he probably wondered if Candace was returning for the night, But this car was approaching slowly, like the driver was unsure of where to turn in. Eventually, the car did turn into the garage driveway entrance and into the property. Jacques recognized the vehicle as the white Chevrolet that his loan company had provided for Candace's use during this trip. A second car, a red 1962 Chrysler convertible driven by his stepdaughter, was the vehicle the family had driven away in less than an hour earlier. Jacques assumed that his wife had left the convertible with the kids and returned to the apartment in the Chevy. But he really had no idea why she would be coming back to his place. They weren't sleeping together, and he really had no desire to be roped into one of her arguments. So he pulled the balcony sliding door closed and moved the window curtains together. Leaving the fluorescent kitchen light on for his wife, he went into his bedroom and closed the door. He got undressed for bed, so he was only wearing a t-shirt. He'd walked out of the bathroom and turned off the bedroom light when he heard his apartment door open. So he listened for the voices of his wife or the children, but all he heard was the apartment door being closed, and then silence. Confused and a bit concerned, he stood silently in his bedroom listening. But then he heard the sound of someone talking softly to his dog Rocky, and it shocked him because it was a man's voice, and I could see how that would be pretty shocking.
Well, that's not supposed to be there.
Right. So as he opened his bedroom door, Rocky was standing silently beside the intruder, and with the apartment door closed, the bright kitchen light would show the silhouette of this one person standing in the living room. Now this was a big person wearing dark clothing, and as Jacques' eyes adapted to the dark, he recognized this visitor. "Oh, it's you. What are you doing here this time of night?" he asked, and the intruder remained silent, and Jacques was suddenly very terrified. There was a glass bottle in the man's hand as he blocked the path to the front door, and in seconds this younger, larger man would be upon him, and he really had no way to escape. He decided that his best hope was to open the sliding balcony door and yell out for help. As he stepped into the main living room area and headed toward the balcony, his naked lower half was exposed, and the intruder laughed at him. By now, the dog recognized that something bad was going on and began to bark. So Jacques made a desperate lunge for the balcony door, but he never made it there. He stumbled over the coffee table, and the younger man raised the large glass bottle, took a full swing at the back of Jacques' head, cracking his skull. When the attacker swung the thick bottle again, he hit the side of Jacques' head. His body fell to the floor, and then the attacker approached him with a knife. So this was a brutal attack.
It certainly was. Dr. John Handwerker of Key Biscayne, Florida, received a call from Candace's daughter Rita at 4:45 in the morning on June 30th. Handwerker knew Jacques Mossler well, as he had been his personal physician in Miami for 10 years. Rita sounded as if she was crying. "Doctor," she said, "something horrible has happened to my father." Rita explained to the doctor that someone had broken into the apartment. She said that her father might be dead, and he was lying on the floor covered with blood. Handwerker asked if she had called an ambulance or the police, and Rita said no. Her mother told her to call the doctor first. Now this seemed a little odd to Handwerker.
A little odd. It's very odd.
He wondered why anyone would call a family practitioner from a crime scene, rather than calling the police or rescue. He told Rita that he would call the police and drive over. Key Biscayne's about an hour away, so it's going to take a little bit of time. He was figuring the police would arrive before he would.
Well, I would hope so. It shouldn't take them very long.
Nope.
Homicides were very rare in Key Biscayne. In 1964, fewer than 3,000 people lived on the island. The police band radios had been quiet when the dispatcher for Dade County Sheriff's Department put out the call for a unit to respond to a possible homicide at Jacques Mossler's luxury apartment building. The officer closest to the scene at the time was Sheriff's Deputy James Jorgensen. He arrived at the scene in his cruiser at 4:53 a.m. That's less than 5 minutes after he'd been notified. Jorgensen entered the apartment building and ran up the stairs to the second-floor apartment. And the first person that he met outside the apartment door was a short blonde woman in her mid-40s. It was Candace. She stood in the hallway leaning against the wall as if she wanted to distance herself from what was inside of the apartment. Before Deputy Jorgensen could even speak, Candace said, "Come inside, there's been some trouble, he's over there." And her voice seemed more impatient and annoyed than really upset, like someone had been killed.
Like, oh, now I got to clean up this mess.
Yeah, almost like, oh, the dog took a shit on the carpet. It's over there. Take care of it.
Jorgensen asked Candace to show him, and without saying a word, she led him inside and pointed toward the balcony doors. There was an orange blanket on the floor which covered a body. A man's bare foot and lower leg poked out from the blanket, and the victim's hand was still holding onto the drapes. On the coffee table, there was a glass figurine that had been shattered. Jorgensen lifted the blanket and was taken aback by the condition of the body. The skull had been crushed from behind, and there were numerous stab wounds on his back. Blood had congealed beneath and around him, meaning that there were more wounds to his chest or torso. So it's like you said, this was a vicious attack.
Oh yeah, brutal.
When the officer lifted the blanket from the body, Candace began to cry out, "Oh, Jack, Jack, what have you done?" It was odd that the woman was implying that the victim was somehow responsible for his own murder. To control the integrity of the crime scene as best as he could, Jorgensen asked for the dog to be removed from the kitchen and shut into a bedroom. The dog had already tracked blood through the living room and kitchen. Then 3 children came out of the bedroom. They each looked at the officer but walked slowly and calmly out of the apartment.
Yeah, so when Dr. Handworker arrived, he was confused to see several children hanging around, and they were seemingly undisturbed by the nearby presence of their father's dead body. When Candace recognized the doctor, she came out from the bedroom and she greeted him like he was just arriving at a formal dinner party and she'd been waiting for him. "Oh, John, I'm so glad you're here," she said. "Jack shouldn't be surrounded by strangers at a time like this." Now, the doctor felt her demeanor did not fit the traumatic circumstances at all. Understandably, he thought that the wife of a murder victim would be more upset than this, and a lot of people felt that way. Then at 5:10 a.m., the telephone rang in the apartment, kind of startling everyone. It was Rita who picked up the receiver and said hello twice before turning to Dr. Handworker and saying, "That's odd, there's nobody on the line." So she hung up the phone. But later, it would be speculated that the killer had called the apartment to see if the body had been found yet. Detectives arrived at 6 a.m., and they decided to question the widow right away. They found Candace in her husband's bedroom, just off the living area where the medical examiner and forensic techs were working. Candace sat on the edge of the king-size bed in white capri slacks and a pink blouse. They would describe her demeanor as if she was waiting for an appointment at the hairdresser's.
Okay.
So right away, these people are having a bad opinion about Candace's response to this.
Right.
And people that knew them better were having many, many more suspicions.
I'm sure they were. So they brought 2 dining room chairs into the bedroom for the detectives to sit on. Then they closed the bedroom door and sat down to speak to the widow, who still seemed remarkably calm. There were no tears, there were no signs of anger at whoever killed her husband. She showed no urgency that most family members have when someone is murdered. In fact, she just seemed like a bad actress. So in this early interrogation, Candace covered her face with her hands, shook her head in feigned despair, and repeated, "Oh, Jack."
Well, we think it was feigned, right?
We think.
I don't want to prejudge her too much.
And with each question, she would sigh and shake her head. So the detectives didn't have patience for what they saw as false drama. But at the same time, they knew that she had to be dealt with carefully in order to prevent her from lawyering up.
Well, yeah, after some prodding, Candace eventually described what had happened that night. She said that she and the children left the apartment around 12:45 a.m. to buy postage stamps and to put some bills in the mail.
Well, what better time?
So that was odd. Her daughter Rita had driven the red convertible, and she and the children had gone to the front desk of the DuPont Hotel in downtown Miami to buy the stamps. And then she'd had the children put the bills in the hotel's mailbox. Of course, the detectives immediately wondered why she would drive all the way downtown to buy postage stamps. Was it her way of setting up an alibi, they had to wonder. When leaving the DuPont, Candace claimed to have felt one of her migraines coming on, so she told the 2 detectives that she had already been to Jackson Memorial Hospital on 2 occasions for treatment of the migraines on this visit to Florida. So it seemed important to her that the police knew about these earlier hospital visits, like it was setting it up as being a normal thing to do, or
for an alibi.
Right. So they might say, well, why were you out in the middle of the night? Well, I did it 2 other times because I get migraines.
Right.
Yeah. According to Candace, she spent nearly 3 hours in the emergency room. At the hospital, she received an injection to treat her headache. At about 3:45 a.m., she, Rita, and the 3 younger children left the hospital and returned to the apartment building. Candace told the detectives that one of the boys noticed that the apartment light was on as they approached the door. Daddy must be up late reading, she had told the children. We don't know why they went back to the apartment and not just back to the hotel to bed.
Right.
But when they entered the apartment, they discovered his body wrapped in the blanket near the balcony door. And later it was speculated that the killer had taken the time to wrap Jacques' body in the blanket to keep the children from seeing their father's nude, bloody, pretty much mutilated body. But if the killer had no personal connection to the victim, why would he go to the trouble of wrapping the body? So it really pointed to a killer who knew Jacques, and or his family at least.
Yeah, and as Candace told the detectives about the horror of seeing the backside of her husband's crushed skull, she wailed and fell backwards onto the bed. She spent the next several minutes cradling her head and moaning. She seemed agitated and exhausted, but there was not a tear in sight.
Now, maybe her behavior was a little odd because she was on drugs. That could have made her affect a little odd.
Oh, sure.
Okay. But the detectives did ask her outright if she had killed her husband. She denied it, but said she understood they were just doing their jobs and they had to ask. When asked if her husband had any enemies, Candace smiled and she told them that her husband worked in finance and was responsible for repossessing people's cars and other property. He had also put several people out of business over the years. So yes, she said, there were probably many people who would want her husband dead. When asked what she thought had happened, Candace was happy to speak about that, and she opined that it had been a robbery. Her jewelry was missing from the bedroom, and cash left out in Jacques' wallet was missing. This was several $100s. She suggested that the burglars hadn't known that someone was home, and that Jacques had probably tried to fight back.
Yeah, but the detectives did not see this scene as a burglary gone wrong. There was no sign of forced entry into the apartment, and other than the broken glass on the coffee table, nothing looked disturbed. So there's no big fight or anything going on. This appeared to be a crime of passion. There had been something personal between the murderer and his victim. The police felt that a random burglar would not take the time to wrap a dead body in a blanket, and the dog had not tried to detour the killer. So detectives told Candace that her husband's murder does not fit the pattern of a burglary. Burglars are after property, and they avoid violence if at all possible. And the manner of his death would be unusual for a burglary gone wrong also. He was beaten and stabbed, and whoever killed him had a lot of rage toward Jacques.
Well, Candace then told the detectives that her husband had become distant with her over the past couple of years. She said he had a habit of bringing young men to the apartment, and the detective kind of knew what she was getting at, and he asked her, "Mrs. Mossler, are you saying that your husband was a homosexual?" Candace turned away from the 2 detectives and said, "I don't know that he was, Lieutenant, but I have been hearing those rumors for some time now. It could explain how he ended up meeting such a horrible end." So she's really pointing them towards that.
That's good thinking on her part, because that would be, if he had a gay lover, that could be the crime of passion.
Yes, sure. I'm sure she thought that through.
Yeah.
But there was really no evidence that he had ever slept with men.
Well, a minor detail.
And the business thing does have a little bit of weight to it. I'm sure he had some people who disliked him for that, or even hated him.
Yeah, but what they would do would either be hire a hitman, or if they did it themselves, it would be just a simple gunshot to the head.
Probably, yes.
They wouldn't go through all the stabbing.
And how would they have gotten into the apartment even? They wouldn't have a key.
Yeah.
Detectives interviewed the neighbors in the apartment building, and they spoke with 29-year-old Peggy Fletcher. She told detectives that she ran out of cigarettes and left her apartment around 1 a.m. to go to the store. Asked if it was unusual for her to make a late-night run to the store, she said it really wasn't. She usually was up late, and she felt safe in the area. She recalled that as she tried to pull out of the parking lot, there was a red convertible blocking her way, and its motor was running. It took a moment, she said, but the convertible pulled into the street to let her out. The top was up, so she didn't really get a clear look at who was driving, she said. But when probed further, she said that she thought the driver was Rita. She also saw some children in the back seat, but couldn't identify which children they were. She had met the Mossler family several times, so she was familiar with Candace and her children. When she came back to the apartment at 1:20 or 1:25 a.m., she said, that convertible was no longer at the property. Peggy told the detectives that she went to bed around 1:45 a.m., and that's when she heard some sort of scuffle inside the Mossler apartment. She said it sounded like there was a fight. She heard someone bump into a wall, and after that thud against the wall, she heard someone crying out, "Don't you do this to me." Now that must have been Mr. Mossler, she said. Then it got quiet for a moment, but it still sounded like there was some kind of skirmish going on. And then Peggy said she heard a man's voice from somewhere in the building, yelling for someone to take that dog inside. It was one of the tenants trying to quiet the dog down. So Peggy heard someone in Mr. Mossler's apartment say, "All right, I'm bringing him in now," or something like that to the other neighbor. So she'd heard quite a bit.
She did.
She was a really good, maybe not eyewitness, but ear witness.
And there's more. She also said that she heard the apartment door open and then close. She didn't open her own door to see anyone leave the apartment because she was frightened. But she did say she heard a man's footsteps running down the stairway after the apartment door slammed. And she said they were big, heavy footsteps, so her belief was that it was a man.
Why she didn't call 911 at that point, I don't understand.
I don't either. I mean, when she's back in the apartment, she hears what sounds like a fight in the other apartment and footsteps running down the stairs. Yeah,
even if you didn't think it was a murder, you think you'd call and have it checked out.
Yeah, domestic violence of some kind.
Absolutely, right. So this was a very interesting lead. They investigated Candace's leads of a robber or a male lover, but they were also keeping a close eye on her. They learned that her nephew Mel had arrived at the Houston airport on the afternoon of June 29th, where he bought a one-way ticket to Miami. His only luggage was a briefcase, and after arriving in Miami, he was seen at a Holiday Inn near Jacques' apartment building. While there, he had frequented the bar. On one visit to the bar, he asked for an empty glass bottle and took it with him. He returned to the bar at closing time and ordered a double scotch. And by the time the police arrived at the murder scene, Mel was at the Miami airport buying a one-way ticket back to Houston.
After Jacques had kicked Mel out of his house, Mel had been living in an apartment and running a mobile home sales business south of Houston. When he was interviewed, he told detectives that he had been in Houston the whole time. He had seen a movie, but he couldn't remember the theater, and he couldn't remember the name of the movie. You got to be quicker than that. I mean, if you say, "Oh, yeah, here's my alibi," you ought to be able to say it was this movie at this time at this theater.
Oh, absolutely.
So we're not looking real good here, Mel.
Well, and just flying to Miami and back like that.
Yep.
So Mel was soon arrested, and he was charged with capital murder. When his office was searched, a photo of Mel and Candace sitting close together at a nightclub was found. And they also found letters that Candace had written to Mel. And these sounded a lot like love letters. She said she couldn't imagine her life without him. She loved him. She needed him. She longed for him.
Candace admitted herself to St. Luke's Hospital for nervous strain, and she had 2 private guards outside her room. But she did allow newspaper reporters into her room for a press conference. She wore a pink nightgown as they gathered around her hospital bed.
She just had a real flair for the dramatic.
I guess she did. She told them that Mel would never hurt her husband. In fact, she said he would be the first to save Jacques and her children if an atomic bomb were to fall. Great analogy.
I know.
She said that the idea of her and Mel having an affair was just absurd. The nightclub photo was taken when they were out with a group of friends. And her letters to Mel were just the way she wrote to all of her family and close friends.
Well, that's kind of gross. Yeah. Dear Mom, I long for you.
I can't live without you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Candace was actually quiet for the next year or so as detectives continued to work on the case. She spent time with her children and their nanny in Rochester, Minnesota, where she rented adjoining apartments. And she frequented the Mayo Clinic for treatment of her migraines. And she gave just one interview during this time. She spoke with a Miami Herald reporter and told him how Jacques had become unstable in the last months of his life. She also said that he had been getting letters on pink stationery from a man who was blackmailing him.
In June of 1965, Candace took the children to Jacques' grave at Arlington National Cemetery. This was at the first anniversary of his death. She hired a professional photographer who took photos and sent them with a typed statement to wire services.
Wire services, that means it's going out to all the magazines and newspapers as a story. So she wants these to be made public.
Yes.
And the statement along with them claimed that doctors had advised her not to travel, but that she had insisted on going to his grave so that he would never be forgotten.
That's an admirable thing.
Yes.
Less than 1 month later, Candace was indicted along with Mel on capital murder charges. Mel had been in jail since his arrest. Prosecutors made an announcement that they had found new evidence proving Candace and her nephew had been plotting to murder Jacques for at least 2 years before his death.
So this was huge news. The trial began in January of 1966, and it was a sensational story. Now it's often compared to the O.J. Simpson trial that happened in 1995. On the opening day of testimony, Candace arrived dramatically, dressed all in white. Photographers waited for her picture as she exited her car. Crowds of people, mostly women, stood in line hoping for a seat in the courtroom. And they looked at Candace like she was a movie star instead of an accused killer. When she entered the courtroom, Mel was already there. He sat to the far end of his defense table and mostly looked at the floor. The lead prosecutor started out by saying that Candace had seduced Mel, convinced him that she loved him, and persuaded him to fly out to Miami and kill her husband. While he did that, she went to the hospital with her kids to create an alibi for herself. So that all sounds pretty reasonable to me. According to the prosecutor, Mel had bludgeoned Jacques and stabbed him 39 times, and he did it so he could be with Candace, and, of course, so they could have all of the money.
Well, that's the bottom line, right?
Yeah, that's kind of a bonus.
Now, the defense attorney for Candace and Mel was Percy Foreman, who was quite well known. He had gotten acquittals for over 100 defendants, and usually his strategy was to put the victim on trial. So Percy told jurors that thousands of people hated Jacques Mossler and that he was a ruthless businessman who had received so many threats on his life that he kept an axe beside his bed. So what's he going to do? A guy opens the door with his gun to shoot Jacques and he throws his axe at him?
Well, I mean, maybe. When he was murdered, there was no gun, so an axe might have been handy. I keep weapons and sprays and things at my bedside table.
I know. I'm just waiting for it to go off accidentally one night.
Well,
not the gun. There's no gun there.
There's no gun. I don't have a gun. But I do have the bear spray. I have the little bracelet that turns into a knife. I'm well stocked because I read about a lot of murders.
3 dogs.
3 dogs around me, yeah.
So Percy Foreman said that Jacques also had gangsters and dangerous people to his house who he hired to take care of his many blackmailers. He did not have any evidence to back up these claims, but nevertheless he was a convincing speaker. He also claimed that Jacques had an insatiable desire for high school and college-age boys that he met in bars frequented by gay men. We're doing a pretty good job of blaming the victim here, aren't we?
Yeah, talk about destroying the victim. I mean, certainly back then, being gay was not looked upon well. And the fact that they've kind of got him as a predator going after young boys, they're really not helping him out at all. So Candace sat by during this, blinking back tears and dabbing at her face with tissues. It was an all-male jury, and supposedly they couldn't keep their eyes off of her. Some observers would say that they felt the trial was over as soon as Candace sat down in her dress and smiled at the jurors. The media also seemed to be in love with Candace. She happily spoke with reporters, and she even invited a few to her house in the evening. One newspaper columnist wrote that he ate dinner with her, and he found himself wishing her luck. Her 4 adopted children, who were now ages 11 to 15, were moved to Miami and enrolled in local schools under assumed names for the duration of the trial. And the children told one reporter that their mother was a loving woman who would never have wanted harm to come to her husband. Daniel told a story about his father flashing $100 bills around town and propositioning strange men. So if this was not true, it's very cruel to do this to a deceased person, turn their children against them.
Yeah, well, he's hired to defend Candace.
Yeah, he's going to do anything.
And he's going to do what he needs to do.
I guess so, yeah. But the idea that Jacques was a closeted homosexual was a recurrent theme in the defense's case. He had a former handyman of the Mosslers testify that he had seen Jacques with 3 shirtless men at his Galveston Beach property, and he said they were talking kind of loud and fancy. Whatever that means.
Right.
In response, prosecutors described Candace as a dangerous adulterer who was capable of destroying anyone who got involved with her. There were witnesses who had seen Candace and Mel together acting too passionate for aunt and nephew. They'd been seen kissing and hugging. One employee at their ranch remembered seeing the two disappear into a trailer for a while, and when they came out, the bed was all messed up. So that sounds like something was up.
It does.
One of Mel's co-workers testified that Mel often bragged to him that he could get anything he wanted from Candace just by performing oral sex on her. Now, as you can imagine, in that time, that comment shocked the courtroom, and there were audible gasps. As the trial went on, there was no direct evidence presented that connected Candace and Mel to Jacques' death. The murder weapon had not been found, and there were no eyewitnesses. Mel's palm print had been identified on the kitchen counter of Jacques' apartment, but there was no way to determine when it had been left there.
The prosecution said that the Dade County detectives had interviewed 5 men who claimed that Candace and Mel had tried to hire them to kill Jacques. A gas station attendant testified that Mel asked him to kill Jacques, take his body to Mexico, and get rid of it inside a volcano. Well, that would do it. One of Mel's co-workers at the mobile home sales office testified that Mel had tried to talk him into doing the murder. Mel had demonstrated how he would like Jacques stabbed, but the co-worker told him that he wasn't interested. Didn't say you need help, call the police, anything like that. I don't want to do it.
Well, he certainly seemed to have some rage, Mel did, toward Jacques.
Yes. Well,
there was a fight when he was thrown out, I'm sure.
Jacques is keeping Mel away from Candace and keeping him away from money.
Right, exactly. There was a former cellmate who also testified that Mel had confessed to him about the killing, but the jury and reporters in the courtroom were very skeptical of the testimony of these men because they were kind of shady guys.
Yeah.
And Candace came across as just so refined.
Closing arguments began on March 3rd. The prosecutor spoke for just over 1 hour, calling Candace the mastermind and manipulator of the crime. She wanted his fortune, and the only way for her to accomplish that was to eliminate him completely.
Yeah, but defense attorney Foreman was excellent and convincing for Candace and Mel. He spoke for 5 hours. It required 3 intermissions. He quoted Shakespeare and Jesus. He referred to Candace as that sweet little woman, and Mel as that innocent boy. He also went after the detectives who had worked the case, claiming that they had made deals with the 4 daughters from Jacques' first marriage, that they had agreed to make up testimony against Candace and Mel so the daughters would inherit the estate and then they would pay off the detectives from those funds. With absolutely no evidence to that accusation, he continued on with it, and it was allowed. He instructed the jury to look at Candace, who sat at the table, and she held a bouquet of flowers. And his final line was, "Let him among you without sin cast the first stone." Which, that's a funny line, because does that mean he's conceding that she had an affair with her nephew? because he seems to be admitting there was some kind of sin going on.
Yeah, maybe he's confessing to the adultery. I just thought he was trying to show off, quote a biblical verse.
Well, I guess so. I'm just trying to find the meaning of it. Like, yeah, they may have sinned in some ways, but they're not murderers, and if you're without sin, then you can punish them. Because that's what that saying means, basically.
Right.
So the jury deliberated for 3 full days before returning with their not guilty verdict. Upon hearing it, Mel said, "Beautiful." Candace cried. In the hallway afterwards, she actually kissed all 12 of the jurors, remember they were all men, saying, "Thank you for my children's sake." And one of these jurors actually said, "God bless you, ma'am." So it's kind of sickening for anyone who believes she was behind this. And what's with the all-male jury? That's not allowed anymore, is it? That sounds old-fashioned. I don't think that's allowed.
It could be. I mean, as long as the defense or prosecution doesn't object, why couldn't you end up with an all-male or all-female jury?
I don't know. I don't think you're supposed to. But we'll look into that because I'm not sure. In the crowd outside, many people were shocked that the pair had been set free. But others wept in relief for Candace, seeing her as this loving mother who had escaped from corrupt detectives who had tried to destroy her life. Many of her neighbors were horrified that she was staying in River Oaks, and they stopped attending any events at her home and stopped inviting her to their parties. She was a murderer who had sex with her sister's son, despite this not guilty verdict, at least in their minds. But Candace focused on running her late husband's businesses. She attended board meetings, and she even planned the construction of another bank in Miami. At the grand opening, she wore a cowboy hat, high-heeled boots, and a fur-lined cape, and she welcomed everyone there. She also bought office buildings in Miami, oil wells in Louisiana, and apartments in Beverly Hills. She seemed to be smart enough to handle it.
In October 1967, Candace attended a Houston benefit concert with Mel at her side. Aretha Franklin sang, and the proceeds went to Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference.
Yeah, so she kind of had a way of making herself likable, doing this philanthropy.
Yeah.
Mel and Candace were also seen shopping in a department store for curtains and lighting fixtures. They went to baseball games together and at least one Broadway musical. It was rumored that Mel bought her an engagement ring while they were on holiday in Switzerland, too. But still, Candace insisted that they weren't involved. She said that she hardly ever saw him because he was very busy starting a new career as a commercial property developer. And you have to wonder how much Candace was financing this.
100%.
Well, maybe, but Mel did do really well in real estate. He bought rundown buildings and flipped them for large profits. And one broker who Mel befriended met him for drinks, and as they talked, Mel told him that he was tired of Candace. This man said that Mel told him he was ready to move on from her, but he needed to do it slowly so he wouldn't set her off. He said that Candace was unpredictable and jealous, and he was afraid of what she might do if she found out that Mel was with another woman. But Candace was already suspicious that Mel was seeing someone else. She'd actually hired a private detective in Houston to follow him. One afternoon, Candace stopped by, and she asked the other broker if he knew where Mel was. Now, he hadn't seen Mel, but she smiled at him, and as he looked into her car, he saw a pistol on the seat beside her. So he wondered what was going on there.
2 days later, Mel told the broker that he and Candace had gotten into an argument at her estate. He went into the bathroom and shut the door, walking over to the sink, and then Candace fired her pistol 3 times through the bathroom door. If Mel had been standing behind the door, he likely could have been killed.
Well, I think he absolutely would have been killed, or at least shot.
He would have been shot.
Yeah.
Now, Mel never notified the police, and he told the broker not to tell anyone.
Well, Mel and Candace did eventually agree to go their separate ways. Mel became kind of a playboy. He let his hair grow down his shoulders, he got a thick mustache, and he started wearing jeans and leather jackets. So he had plenty of women in his life. By this time, Candace was in her 50s, but she still had plenty of men interested in her as well. She actually threw a birthday party for herself, and Chuck Berry performed. Remember, he did Johnny Be Good?
Maybelline.
Some really famous stuff in the 50s.
Yes.
So on a stage in her yard, she gave him a long, lingering wet kiss in front of everyone. And as it turns out, Candace had had many sexual encounters with Chuck. In his 1987 autobiography, he actually wrote an entire chapter just about Candace and her big circular bed.
All right.
So I might have to read that book.
In 1971, Candace remarried. Her new husband was a self-employed electrician named Barnett Garrison, a big strapping guy. He was 32 and she was 51.
Well, she liked those big strapping guys. That's how Mel was.
Yeah, well, and she liked money too, and that's how Jacques was.
So you got to have one or the other. Now she's got the money, she just needs a new strapping guy, I guess.
Yeah, well, and the nice thing about young strapping guys is you can go through them. Get tired of one, move on to another. So they seemed to be happily married until Candace learned that he was going to a club and seeing go-go dancers. Then, one night after closing, the club burned down, right to the ground. The fire investigators suspected that Candace had set the fire, but they didn't have the evidence to arrest her. In a Society column interview years later, Candace was asked if she had started the blaze. According to her interviewer, Candace waved one hand dismissively and said, "I certainly would understand doing such a thing."
So that's kind of saying you did it. Almost.
Pretty much.
Then, just 1 year after their wedding, Barnett Garrison was found face down on the Mossler estate's patio, and he was in a pool of his own blood. But he wasn't dead. It was the evening of Saturday, August 12th, 1972. Barnett and Candace had an argument. So he walked out of the house and drove to one of the clubs. Then at 4 a.m, he called his parents to ask if he could stay at their house. Barnett's mother told him that his twin sister and her family were using the house that weekend, and he didn't tell his mother about any issues with Candace and hung up. But in the early morning hours of Sunday, August 13th, Garrison returned to the home that he shared with Candace. He didn't have any keys to the mansion on him. His ringing of the doorbell was either not heard or it was ignored. So locked out, he walked to the back of the house and climbed to the third-floor balcony, which was outside of the master bedroom. He scaled up to the third floor where he grabbed the roof's gutter. His hands either slipped or a piece of the gutter broke, and he fell to the roof of the home's second floor, slid down the steep slate roof head first, and landed on a patio table. And he lay there until he was discovered at 10 a.m. by one of the household staff. He had an unloaded 9mm pistol found near his body, still inside of a carrying case. When the Houston Police Department detectives arrived at the scene, they heard dramatic cries coming from the master bedroom. The bedroom door was locked, and the detectives had to convince Candace to come out. According to the detectives, she was incoherent, and they couldn't interview her at all. Barnett Garrison was alive, but he was in critical condition. An ambulance took him to the emergency room, and he had a collapsed lung, rib fractures, and a fractured hip. The next day he was transferred to another hospital, where he stayed in a coma for 6 weeks.
When Candace came to the hospital, she brought along her attorney. She told one detective that she had no idea why her husband had climbed the roof. She said that she had been asleep and heard nothing. And then regarding the gun found near his body, Candace said that her husband carried a gun because he often carried cash from his nightclubs. Just over $1,000 was found in his pocket. When the police were done questioning Candace, she joined her husband's family members in the hospital waiting room, and it was clear to anybody looking in that she was not welcome at all.
Well, one of Candace's relatives who spent time with her in the early 70s said that she believed Candace had hired 2 bootlegging cousins from Georgia to teach Barnett a lesson, and that they had actually thrown him off of the roof. But after months in the hospital and enduring multiple surgeries, Barnett was released into the care of his parents in the suburb of Sugar Land, Texas. He had severe brain damage and was unable to remember the evening of the accident. His family, though, suspected that Candace had locked him out of the mansion and told the household staff not to let him in, because it's really hard to believe that no one heard him.
It sure is.
Candace kept with her story, though, that she was asleep after taking her sleeping pills. So she had no way of knowing that he was trying to climb up to their bedroom. And it would turn out she was probably getting a pretty serious problem with pills by this point.
In December of 1972, Candace went to the Garrison family home to see her husband and take him back to her mansion. The Garrison said that Candace arrived wearing a mink coat and used one of her high-heeled shoes to knock on their front door.
I've only seen that in movies.
It's dramatic, isn't it?
It is. She had a flair.
Barnett's mother believed that Candace was under the influence of drugs. She actually left dents on the door with her shoes. On another visit, Candace slipped a note under the door, which read, "Barnett, I love you, but your mother won't let me see you."
Yeah, so it's hard to know what to actually think about this. I think this was a tumultuous relationship for sure. A lot of jealousy and fighting going on. But it's hard to know if Candace was just really doped out that night or if she really did have anything to do with this happening to him.
Well, I would think there's a relation or something in common with her old husband and her new husband.
It does seem like a coincidence to have two husbands end up in that kind of shape.
Yes, it does.
Because Barnett was alive, but he would require medical and nursing care for the rest of his life. And in 1974, Candace filed for divorce, citing a conflict of personalities. In the divorce file, Candace stated that Barnett had recovered from his injuries and no longer required medical care. But that was not true. She had said that, maybe, so she wouldn't have to pay for all of his medical care.
Sure.
But the divorce was finalized in 1975, and Candace went back to using the Mossler name. After settling Jacques' estate, Candace executed a will which would establish trusts for all 6 of the children. The trusts were to provide structured distributions at periodic intervals throughout the children's lives. And the intent of the staggered payments, she said, was to make sure that none of the children wasted their inheritance. But at least 2 of her adopted children believed that Candace had set up the staggered distributions as a way of controlling them and keeping their loyalty. As teenagers, Candace had given them all cars and gifts and pretty much anything they wanted, but in return she had always expected them to stand by her side. She had shown some real preferential treatment to her 2 biological children, and she didn't want the 4 older children to get anything from Jacques.
Oh, sure.
2 of the adopted boys ended up suing Candace for fraudulent mismanagement of their trust fund, and they said that Candace had used their money to pay attorney's fees from her murder trial. These charges were similar to those made against Candace by Jacques' 4 daughters years earlier. Also, Candace had given a Ferrari to Barnett's physician in appreciation for taking care of him, which really angered the children as well. The way they looked at it, she was spending their money.
Yeah, she was.
So that civil case went to trial in 1973.
Yeah, Candace testified that she did not approve of the boys' lifestyle, sharing stories of their drinking, marijuana use, and shady friends. In her testimony, Candace explained why she had washed her hands of her sons Danny and Chris. Candace had bragged for years that she was wealthy in her own right, before even meeting Jacques Mossler.
Yeah, so drinking, marijuana use, and their friends she's against. But she could have sex with her nephew and take a lot of pills.
Yeah. Oh, different categories.
And there was no proof that she had any wealth when she met Jacques.
No.
When Dan and Chris pressed their mother for money, she told them that they were already receiving their share of their father's estate. And when it came to her money, she told Dan that she could tie it up forever. So they hoped to show that Candace had not brought any wealth into the marriage to help with their case. Dan and Chris's attorney was able to bring up questions about Candace's life before she married Jacques Mossler. And she was forced to testify, and she rehashed some of her sketchy stories that she had told decades earlier. She testified that she had designed ads, not clothing, for a design firm. And she also testified that she had become wealthy by running Candace's finishing school and Candace's modeling school in New Orleans. But the boy's attorney jumped on that one. "Isn't it a fact that the place where you lived in New Orleans was a whorehouse?" he asked her. Candace's attorney rose to object, but Candace was not going to just sit there and be insulted. So she lost her cool completely and ended up in a shouting match, ignoring her own attorney.
Yeah, then the boy's attorney turned to a very sore subject, and that was Candace's age. He was able to produce a birth certificate which documented her birthday as February 18th, 1920. The basis for bringing up Candace's age was to establish that she was a frequent liar. But rather than admit her true age, Candace perjured herself. On a roll with her lies, she claimed that she had once earned a huge income as a model. They couldn't buy my time modeling, she bragged. Cadillac or somebody offered me $50,000 just to stand by a Cadillac. And I said, no, I'm not in that bracket now.
Wow, she was in a high bracket.
Yeah. And then she accused the police of stealing financial documents and at least $200,000 from her.
Well, by this time, Candace's children had watched her become addicted to opiates and sedatives. She was dependent on Placidil, a barbiturate, and Demerol, a highly addictive painkiller, which she had injected at her many visits to the doctor and the emergency room. Dan and Chris hoped to establish that Candace's drug use had affected her competency. Her behavior was really backing up this claim in court, and in the end she was ordered to make payments from the estate to all of the adopted children. But then, out of anger, she disinherited them out of her will, or at least 3 of them, not the youngest.
In October 1976, Candace flew from Houston to Miami for a board of directors meeting. She checked into a suite at the Fontainebleau, and that evening she called her Miami doctor and told him she had a terrible headache. He came to her hotel and gave her an injection of Demerol and Phenergan. These are a pain medication and an anti-nausea sedative commonly given together. But the doctor didn't know that she'd already taken Placidil. So her secretary found her the next morning face down on her hotel bed. The coroner ruled her death an incautious self-overdosage of barbiturates.
So she'd probably taken more than 1 Placidil. She'd probably taken quite a bit.
Yeah, and then she had the additive effect of the other drugs.
Exactly.
So she's 62 years old, and she's dead.
Yeah, so she died fairly young. Presidents of the Mossler banks and friends and relatives from Georgia did attend her funeral, but only 2 of her children, the oldest Rita and the youngest adopted boy Eddie, showed up for the service. One interesting surprise was that Mel was there with his latest girlfriend. Candace was buried beside her second husband, Jacques Mossler, in Arlington National Cemetery. Now, there were many different opinions about Candace, who actually did do some good work with the Mosslers' fortune. But one opinion shared by most everyone was that Candace was behind Jacques' murder and that she'd gotten away with it.
And I would also say that she had something to do with her other husband's murder, Barnett.
Well, he wasn't murdered. He was alive.
Attempted murder.
Okay.
How's that?
Well, and she destroyed his life.
Yeah.
He was kind of an invalid and was never independent again. So yeah, I actually believe she probably did have something to do with both. And although she did get away with it, it seemed like maybe it haunted her. Maybe that was part of her drug addiction. Maybe she did feel some guilt about it. Yeah. But it's a fascinating story.
It is. I kind of remember it from my teenage years.
Oh, do you?
Yeah, it was big.
Big case, yeah. So thank you to Linda L. for recommending it.
Well, there's some others too that I didn't write down, but
I always give it to the first one.
That's the one I wrote first.
Okay. TCB's music was written and produced by Tristan Capel. If you have a case suggestion or you'd like to share some interesting comments or opinions on a case with us, we encourage you to send us an email to truecrimebrewery@tiegrabber.com. Or if you're someone who really wants your voice to be heard, you can leave us a voicemail. There's a link to do that in our show notes. There's also a little widget to click on our website to do that. We love to listen to your voicemails, and we try and play as many of them as we can. So thank you to all of you who have sent us feedback in whatever form. If you're interested in getting your future TCB episodes without commercials, and getting our extra members-only episode each month, plus a gift, you might want to subscribe as a tie grabber at our website, tiegrabber.com. There's also a long backlist of episodes from our premium feed available to both new and long-term subscribers. So it might be a handy way to keep your ears busy. If you're interested in that, just click on subscribe at tigrabber.com or click on the link in our show notes. We also have a Patreon page where you can support us and get access to the premium show on the webpage or on your podcast app. We also have all kinds of merch for sale at tigrabber.com/shop. Okay, that's enough of my spiel. What have we got for feedback?
We have the usual 2 voicemails and 1 email. The first voicemail is from Carrie with a case suggestion.
Hey, Dick and Jill. My name is Carrie, and I live in Richmond, Virginia. Love your show. Love your back and forth banter. My favorite is when cuss words come out of Jill's mouth in her sweet voice. I laugh out loud every time. Wanted to suggest a case from Richmond. I think October 2004 is when it happened, and then the trial was the next year. A University of Richmond professor named Friedrich Jablin, Jablin, was shot and killed in his driveway. His ex-wife, Piper Roundtree, Rountree, was convicted. There had been a custody battle going on, if I remember correctly. It's an interesting case with some little twists and turns, some disguises and that sort of thing. I think it would be a good case and interesting for you all to do. As far as beer suggestions, I, at this stage in my life, do not drink, but I know that we have numerous craft breweries in town. So, Dick, I would think that you could find something, if not many things, that interest you. Keep up the good work. I am a premium member and love all my swag, especially my snifter. I like to eat a little bit of ice cream out of it at night from time to time. Take care, guys. Keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you, Carrie.
See all the uses you can get out of your snifter?
I like that one.
That's a good one.
Maybe a root beer float or something would be good too.
I think it would.
Yeah, they're very handy little glasswares.
So, and this is a pretty good case. I didn't want to talk about the inconsistencies or twists and turns in this case. So if we want to do it, I'll do some research and we can see where we go.
Okay, sounds great. And what year was that?
2004.
Okay. Anything after 2000 I think of as recent. I guess it's because I'm getting old. So that sounds like a good one to look into.
Okay.
All right, let's play another voicemail. This one from Marianne.
Also a case suggestion.
Hi, this is Marianne from the Twin Cities in Minnesota. I found your podcast on YouTube a few months ago and became a subscriber soon afterwards. I really like the beer reviews and the research and format that you use. I have a case suggestion for my husband's family. Our nephew's wife, Marilyn McIntyre, was murdered in 1980. The case went unsolved until it was reopened in 2009. Marilyn's murderer was convicted in 2010. There has been a 48 Hours, Exhumed, and other cable channel shows on Marilyn's murder. The Exhumed show disclosed some fascinating facts about how law enforcement solved the case. Speaking for myself, these facts were hard to learn, but it's good that Marilyn's case was solved. Even though I don't like to say her murderer's name, it is Curtis Forbes. You can learn more about the details searching under Marilyn McIntyre's name or his name. A beer suggestion for the show is anything from the New Glarus Brewery because it's near the town where Marilyn was murdered, Columbus, Wisconsin. And I want to do a shout out to my local brewery, Unmapped in Glen Lake, Minnesota. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Marianne.
Yeah, this is an excellent case. I mean, it's one of these cold cases that finally gets solved. I think it was almost 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a big twist in the sense that her husband, all those years, had been a suspect.
Okay.
He's the one that found her.
Right.
And everybody knew he did it, and he didn't.
Well, that sounds really fascinating.
Yeah, I think so.
And plus, she had kind of a personal connection to it, which makes it interesting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And her beer suggestion is spot on. New Glarus is a great brewery.
Yeah?
Yeah.
All right, let's go there.
Okay.
Okay, so we do have one email that we're going to read.
We have one email. I put this one in. I think it's an interesting case, but there is also a personal aspect to this one, too. So if you want to read it.
Sure.
It's a little long, but it's okay.
Okay, so this is from Mo. Hi, Dick and Jill. I've been listening to your podcasts for a couple of years now and find them well-researched and interesting. Well, thank you, Mo. It's befuddling to try to understand why humans behave the way they sometimes do. I was wondering if you were interested in doing an episode based on the South Louisiana serial killer Derek Todd Lee. It is assumed he was killing women in South Louisiana maybe as far back as the mid-1980s, up until his eventual capture in 2003. He was arrested several times in that span, but always fell through one crack or another. Fear was palpable in South Louisiana, and because so many women were being murdered, it seemed that nowhere was safe. Women were raped and murdered and abducted in their homes and out on the streets. Additionally, at least 2 other killers were active in the same areas at the same time, Gillis and Guillory. I had my own encounter with Lee in the late 90s. I was home alone with my dog, talking on the phone late at night, when a man came to my front door, claiming to be broken down on the road. He wanted to come in to use my telephone to call a friend for help. It was late at night, I was alone, and that man was a stranger. I wasn't going to open the door for him. You go, girl. I spoke to him through the peephole of my door. I offered to make a call for him. That's when he said he couldn't remember his friend's number. I told him I could call the police for a motorist's assist, and my dog began to bark, and the man disappeared. The responding cops couldn't find anyone or any vehicle broken down on the road. I simply forgot about it until years later I recognized the man being taken into custody as that man at my door that night. It was Derek Todd Lee, the same man who left DNA evidence at 2 crime scenes only a mile from my home. Creepy.
Yeah, isn't that creepy?
That is very creepy. That is like a real nightmare. But you're so smart. You didn't open the door and you're still alive.
That's right.
So I'm very proud of you. You never want to open the door for anyone. No. So yeah, that's fascinating. I'd love to look into that as well. Okay. We're not big serial killer people, but sometimes the stories are interesting enough and we cover them.
That's right.
Absolutely. Okay. Anything else to add, Dickie?
Okay. No, I'm done for today.
Well, let's give a little credit to Mo's dog, too, because I'm sure that helped.
Well, dog barked.
I always recommend having a dog if you can.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh. Or more. Or 2 or 3 or 4.
Well, 3 sounds good.
Okay. So we'll be back pretty soon with our bonus episode for January. Dick's been hard at work on that one. It's a great story. Can you give us just a little taste?
Sure. It's an unsolved crime. 4 people that worked at a Burger Chef restaurant in Indiana in the 1970s were abducted and killed.
So this is an unsolved cold case.
And this is an unsolved case.
But some good ideas about who might have done it, that's for sure.
There are.
So we'll be coming out with that within the next week or so, and we'll be back 2 weeks from today with another regular episode of True Crime Brewery.
You got it.
All right. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you next time at the quiet end.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.